All right, everybody. Welcome to Agentic SaaS Mondays. This is episode number 13. So today we actually have a topic that's very near and dear to the hearts of all of us who've been running this show. This is probably one of the topics I spend more time talking about than any other topic. And that's because we want to talk today about the control plane, what we call the SaaS control plane, what its advantages are, and then specifically, what does it mean kind of going forward? Where did this thing come from? Why do we think this is a concept? And why is it we think it's so important for SaaS? And is it still relevant in the world of agentic AI? And I think I'm going to answer for myself. I'm going to say yes. And we're going to try to talk about why it's still yes today. I'm lucky enough today to have with me a couple people from Omnistrate. If you're not familiar with Omnistrate, I will let Kamal and Alok tell you about them. It's a great company, very much aligned with the concept of control planes, and one I've seen talk to many of my customers about using to manage their SaaS and agentic AI products. And as we often do, I have Airman from AWS also joining me today. So also, we have a great crew. We're going to talk a little bit. First, I want to kick it to you, Kamal, because I think that there's an interesting history behind what we call the control plane. It has a little bit to do with AWS. And I think you might have actually been around at AWS around the time we started to use this term. So why don't you kind of give me some background? When you think of control plane, you think about the history of it. What do you and Alok think about when you think about your days at AWS?
Yeah, very early in the days, we we used to run at AWS what we call CAB. Or we still actually do it yearly. At that time, at least was yearly, and we used to get this customer advisory board, like more like inviting the set of customers to AWS and really just ask them the questions about and learn from them, right? What are their pain points? What are they doing? How can AWS help them? And one of the things that came out was, hey, look, they have, you know, so many tooling that they need to run in the early days of AWS. Because remember, AWS when originally started, it was like foundational web services. Even internally, it was called FWS,
Mhm.
and there were three services mainly at that time, and EC2 was one of them. And so when customers were running workload on EC2, they're like, look, that's great, I got the compute on and I don't have to worry about just putting together data center, but how do I can you make it easy for me to run some of the common tooling, right? Everybody runs databases, everybody run caches, everybody have to run queues and things like that. So can you make it easy, and not only just from the perspective of just spin it up, but also make it as a more managed so I can forget about it, and more work on the abstraction about. And so and our initially when and I was one of the team members that, S3 was the one first control plane that was built at AWS, but that was unique, uh, because that we made a lot of learnings out of it, and from there we derived a generic control plane that today is pretty much powering a lots of services, several dozen, if not one third of the AWS services. um, and so and I was part of that group, right? And we were thinking about building control planes, and our notion was fundamentally that, like, look, all of this human work that or manual work, undifferentiated work, has to be automated. And how do you now bring together the functions of DevOps, SRE, FinOps, SecOps, everything together from the perspective where we don't lose the concept of a customer? And we used to call it, let me see if I can get it right, um, something like, I forgot. It, it was like human. Yeah. Anyways, I forgot about it. I think it was something about human tasks to human bits, and basically talking about going from humans to machines. We don't want humans to do work. We won't want machines to automate. And so there was this slang very very common early in the AWS days. Just not coming to my mind right now. Um, but yeah, and that led to the evolution of control plane. In fact, our initial control plane was super super simple, right? It was just RDS was one of the first services that used that generic control plane, and it was just doing single database provisioning, no backups, no multi-AZ, no concept, like even deployed in one single region, and just automating some of the very basic manual scaling. very, very basic stuff. Like it was very focused on um, from the perspective of provisioning. It was focused on providing the some of the update capabilities. But one of the things that we really get it right first time is the some of the management pieces. We wanted to make sure that if things fail, because it's databases and you cannot be just be down, people rely upon their businesses, so it better be managed properly. And so we did actually a lot of innovation there, because managing distributed systems is not easy. You don't know you yourself is down or isolated from the network, or the actual application is isolated, right? So there is a classic dilemma over there. And so we did a lot of work to get that piece straightened up. But from there, it was like one thing led to another. And as innovation, like the technology innovation happened, as the compliance requirement changes, as the customer expectation changes. Remember, early in the days, it used to take 20-25 minutes to provision a database instance. It was fine. Today,
Right.
20 seconds is a norm. So
Right. Exactly.
customer expectation has also changed from where we were and where we are today. So yeah, and here you are 15 years later, and the control plane is like just as Bill, we have been discussing about in the past, is like an operating system for the cloud. I mean,
Right.
you just need that layer to how to operationalize that all the cloud operations.
Absolutely. And look, I want to pull you into this conversation because, like, some people might be listening, like, oh, S3, these are all old services. Surely we figured out all of these problems now, and no new company needs to work with them. You're the CTO over at Omnistrate. I think you're talking to lots of SaaS customers. Airman, I know you are. When you're talking to SaaS customers, are these same topics that Kamal is talking about deploying your services, managing them, and operating them at scale? Are those still relevant to SaaS providers? And do we still care in the agentic world?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that you just said, right, which is in the agentic world, it's actually, I would say, even more important to have some sort of a structure, or think of like some sort of a process around building and distributing your applications, right? I think with things like S3 and EC2 and all of these, they tend to be tier one services, so you don't really think much about it. And largely, if you think about it, S3 is the old, the old serverless solution, right? Because technically you don't really provision any of these things. But what customers are looking for is essentially providing S3-like interfaces to their own customers, right? Which means there is an entire there's so much work that needs to go into to provide that abstraction for your customers. And that's essentially where all of the bits around the control plane comes in, which is you have to make things seamless. You have to keep tabs on your services. You need to keep tabs on not just yours but the downstream services. So how do you all put and orchestrate all of these things? And I would actually argue that for agentic applications, it's even more complex, because you're particularly not only dealing with expensive infrastructure, potentially like GPUs, but also dealing with things like data, right? Which is very, from a privacy perspective, from a compliance perspective, customers, I mean, our SaaS providers have their own customers who have needs, right? And so I would actually argue that it's even more important in this current generation for you to actually put together a compelling solution, especially when you have competition that's obviously always increasing.
It makes a lot of sense, but Ermin, I know you work with startups a lot. Now, when I talk to startups, there's always this sort of pushback on doing anything that takes too long. We need to focus on our core product. We need to reach product market fit. A lot of those same things we've talked about before. But when you're talking to startups and when you're talking to the customers you work with, how do you position the control plane? And is it still relevant even at that phase of their development?
So it is relevant in short. And so back to your question. So I really feel privileged to work with startups, right? Because those companies, those customers are moving extremely fast, right? And with startups, it's all about providing value to their customers. And if they need to do heavy lifting in the background, they're gonna do it. Their main focus is customer needs to get new features, right? So that's why I see still a lot of customers starting with the application plane, continuing with the application plane until they start hitting the wall, and then they come and say, okay, they call it issues, right? We have these issues. We need to automate these things. We need to automate. And to be honest, 20 years back when I was building my first SaaS silo application, this is also how I learned that I need a control plane, right? So for me, it was, okay, let's start installing it. And then you start automating things. Then you start actually building onboarding functions. Then you start building your tenant management function. in a separate application. And the sooner they realize that they will need something like a control plane, the easier they will save a lot of troubles and those issues, what they call it, right later. So usually, so it depends a little bit about experience of the CTO. If they already built SaaS solution, they will go immediately with even a basic, but they will actually think of control plane. And it makes sense, right? If you think of control plane, then you will actually start thinking about your tenant management. If you think of tenant management, you will start thinking about data isolation. You will start thinking of onboarding, observability. So suddenly your control plane starts actually being important. So to go back to your question, yes, I do see startups still going, building application planes without control plane, and sometimes that's okay, because you need to prove the value, you need to kind of find your market fit and things like that, and then you solve those control plane problems later. That's why solutions like what you do, guys, in Omnistrate, I find it quite valuable, because you could actually almost get control plane as a service instead of building every single bits and piece on your own.
That's a good point. And I think we kind of reached an interesting point in the conversation here, because we've all been talking about control plane. But what's the definition of a control plane? Like, if anyone out there is like maybe in the shoes Ermin's talking about, like they've got a startup and they're like, I don't know what you're talking about. Like this control plane thing, I can deploy my application. I've got it out to 10 customers already, and everything's going great. Like, why does this control plane concept matter? What's the how would we define this for somebody who is new to this topic? And Ermin, you want to take maybe a first stab at that?
So the way I define control plane is actually that one ring to control to control all the other application planes, right? Because what I've noticed recently, especially when working with startups, a lot of those startups are actually going in a direction of distributed SaaS. That means I'm going to build my application plane so that I can deploy it anywhere, right?
Yes.
Now suddenly you have a different scale of problem, right? And so for me, it's then easier to explain, right? For the moment when you start actually deploying your application as a silo at your customer location or at your customer cloud or whatever, you're gonna need something to kind of manage and observe and do observability, do the payments, everything on a central location, right?
Yeah.
But I'm not pushing startups in a direction where you need to have it, right? So, but
Right.
although personally, I think that you cannot build proper SaaS if you don't have a control plane. So,
oh yeah, that's one of my favorite sayings. It's not SaaS if there's no control plane. You can call it SaaS up until you have it, but at that point, it really becomes SaaS. Kamal, you've been doing this for a long time too. Like I heard, deploying your applications, managing your applications, observability, billing, all of those are at least ingredients. But how would you define the control plane?
The way I would think about it is building an app is one part. Then how do you go from having an app and being able to distribute that app? And that's where you need some sort of a distribution software, right? I mean, let's take a parallel. Like, for example, if you're in baking business and if you're shipping cakes around, you can rely upon FedEx for first few cakes. But if the cost of making a cake is $5 and the cost of shipping is $10, makes no sense. It will not just very quickly will not going to work. Similarly, Netflix, if you think about it, Netflix, YouTube, these are distribution for the content, digital content. Similarly, if you think about DoorDash, that's a food delivery mechanism or distribution mechanism for the food. And we remember the history of that. I mean, we remember 20 years ago how the experience was. You go to the restaurant, you wait for the food to be packaged, you pick up your own food, and look at now on DoorDash, you press a button and food shows up. So similarly, in the software industry, you have an application. How do you distribute that application? Now, there are certain, there's several distribution methods have been built over time. There is on-prem for air-gapped customers. There is, PaaS, which early days of the AWS, which everything was where customer comes and make a deployment to their configuration, to their settings, and optimize the way they want to run. And there is a SaaS evolution of that, which is, saying that, okay, thank you so much, but I don't want to even take a concept of deployment. Just give me an endpoint, and I want just want to be done with it. You take care of the scale, performance, performance, latency, reliability, security. I have nothing to do with any of those. I don't want to even think about, even from the deployment point of view. The trade-offs, all of these trade-offs is the provider's problem, not my customer problem. I just want to build my app on top of it. And then came the BYOC with this agentic world where people are deploying agents into the customer's account, and then there's a new world now, which is how they represent agents as a first-class citizen rather than a traditional software. So, and there are so many variations of each one of them. Now, how do you achieve all these variations? And for each one of them, by the way, you have to worry about the tenant isolation. You have to worry about packaging your software, you're licensing your software, billing your software. You need to worry about multi-tenancy, how multi-tenancy flows in each aspect. You need to worry about deployments. You need to worry about infrastructure. You need to worry about operations, and list goes on and on. That what just makes there are open source tooling for each one of them. But stitching them together, everything in the context of a customer, making it scale and making it seamlessly work across all of these distribution channels, where as your business requirements are changing, as the government regulatory requirements are changing, as the new hardware is coming out, as your customer use cases are evolving, you can evolve quickly. You are not bounded. You're not bounding, making your business bound by the platform. Let your application and you be able to reach wherever the customers are and be able to experiment. This goes back to the point that Armin was making. Like, how do you do the quick experimentation, find it out where the customers are, what configuration they need, do an experimentation, A/B testing, and allow that to the customers and get the feedback, and you can iterate that quick product feedback cycle. That is what the job of the control plane. That's how I would describe it. And you need that central nervous system. Otherwise, it's just otherwise you're just manipulating scripts and just it's a chaos essentially.
Yeah, you've added a lot of chaos to the conversation, which is actually really good, because it's one of the reasons we talk about the control plane being important, but also difficult to build. So, look, I want to kick this to you because you spent a lot of time building this, right? Like, you worked a lot on Omnistrate. You built a lot of control planes in your career. As you think about this chaos and where we are right now, if you're talking to somebody who hasn't built a control plane before, or is just thinking about the need for a control plane, how would you try to simplify some of this chaos? And how have you tried to do that with the Omnistrate product itself?
Yeah, 100%. The way I would think about, actually, in a way to summarize where control plane helps you is, essentially it's converting what you have as just an application or a piece of software into a product that you can actually build a business around, right? And when we say business, the key thing for a business is customers and tenants, right? Basically, that's what we essentially call. And so with what we found out early, and also what we've obviously seen through our journey building different control planes, is the concept of a tenant is primarily what's fundamentally lacking in most tools, right? I mean, if you think about what a typical, homegrown control plane looks like, it's, let's say, for example, people putting together a bunch of, if you're using Kubernetes, it's a bunch of Kubernetes manifests or something around Terraform, right? And so what that is it's a great general purpose tool, and it just works amazing for you to stand up infrastructure, stand up, let's say, services. But what it fundamentally lacks is, there's no concept of a customer, so which means controls around, isolation, tenancy, controls around cost, controls around, billing, that all needs to tie back to your business, right? All of that is fundamentally lacking. And so what we did with Omnistrate is, we thought about this problem from, first principles perspective for control planes. And then we said, let's abstract that concept of a tenant. So everything that you do on Omnistrate involves a tenant, right? So which means everything has a purpose that also serves as almost like a guideline for you when you're actually building your distribution channel, right? So which means it already is a framework that essentially asks you to just fill in the missing details, and then we just basically take it from there, and then we build the distribution channel around it, right? And so we've seen that unlocks a lot of, especially for customers who are starting this from scratch, who barely built something like this before, it starts to become more of like a guidebook. And so they look at this and say, okay, this is great. So, I can take this piece of problem out of my mind. I just have to focus on building the application first, and I iterate through all of that, and then I just hand it off to Omnistrate, and it takes care of essentially connecting my customers with it.
Nice.
Bill,
Yeah,
can
go
I
ahead,
just
Armin. Yeah, absolutely.
The way I understood actually the product from Omnistrate is actually control plane as a service, right? Now that the question that I was asking myself is, do you have a control plane for your control plane as a service?
Yeah. No, I think that's actually the running joke actually when we talk to customers, because the first thing we tell them is, look, we are a control plane of control planes. We used to call this earlier in the early days of Omnistrate as meta plane, right? But obviously it's a little too meta to talk about. So we said, okay, but we do, yes, 100%. So that's actually one of the key things also that we made as a design decision, which is we want to keep our data separated from our customers' data and the customers' data, right? So because we are a control plane as a service, we generate these control planes, essentially printing them for customers, if you will, right? And so those independently are taking care of their businesses, and so we are literally managing a bunch of these control planes in isolation.
In fact, from that perspective, just to quickly interrupt, from that perspective, Armin, we call ourselves as a framework to build control plane, because that makes it easier for everyone to understand that, okay, you use this framework to build your own customized control plane. And that is fundamentally how we are differentiated from Heroku-like systems, right? Where in Heroku-like system, you take an application, you throw an application, and they are hosting it. And there is no concept of tenant, right? And there is no concept of SaaS as such, and there are a lot of aspects of SaaS. The key thing when you're talking about building control plane is you're building your own platform. Right? And you're building your own platform from multi-tenant point of view. So everything that we're talking about here has to work from a tenancy point of view. And the control plane that you build is customized and optimized for their use case, for what is the use case in question, and what distribution channel they want to enable, how they want to serve their customers, how the cost characteristics, the performance characteristics, the scale characteristics tune to that. And the ability that you can have a framework that you can build your custom control plane that lives with you, all the data and everything stays with you, is the key, essentially.
Yeah.
And our responsibility is just to treat that generated control plane as an application, so we can manage that application from outside.
Nice.
But you still manage the application from outside, right? So you still have
just making sure that, like, from the it provides a managed experience on that control plane, that control plane doesn't go down, right? But everything else stays with them, and we just make our responsibility in contract with the customer is like, look, the generated control plane is going to work fine, and if there are operational issues, we will know and we can help with them.
Exactly. And this is where I was going. So sorry, Bill, just to
no, not at all.
Even with such a broad freedom that you give your customers, right, with framework, you still have something that you call your meta plane, or your control plane of control planes, right? And you build it because you need it. So that's why this is exactly, back to your question from before. I don't think control plane is optional when you build SaaS. You're gonna need it sooner or later, and then the sooner you realize that you need something like control plane from Omnistrate, or you build it your own, or third-party application, whatever you do, you cannot build SaaS without a control plane. I don't see that as an option.
100%.
Nice.
That's a great point, actually. Yeah.
So I'll grab the mic here for a minute. I know I'm hosting, but I want to kind of ramble on a little bit. When, working with SaaS Factory over the years, one of the key things I've always heard that resonates with customers is thinking about the control plane as the application that you as a company use to operate your business. And I think it's important when we've sort of gone through the iteration, I'm sure you guys do this in Omnistrate as well, when we iterate over how you're building your control plane, the conversation goes to who are the roles internally that are using these different features. Like if you're building a billing platform and your financial team doesn't have access to that, what's the point? Like, if we're billing our customers, great, the CFOs, that's awesome. How much and when? Where can I see this data? I need the data. You have product teams that need to understand the cost of your individual tenants. You've got, individual deployment teams. Your technical team has an interface into your control plane. They need to understand the state of deployments fail. Everything fails all the time, right? We all understand this is a quote from Werner. Everything fails all the time. Your technical team needs a viewpoint into your control plane. It's how your entire business operates this product. And it's a little bit more of a business conversation in terms of a technical topic that we often drive on. There's lots of technical pieces of this, but really you as a business, if you're going to be successful with your SaaS or your agents or whatever you're deploying, numerous different roles have to have visibility into the operations of that for it to be successful. And if they're waiting on reports from other teams, you're never going to get to that point when you really are able to operate a multi-tenant solution successfully at scale. anyone you talk to at these larger SaaS companies, the ones that have really done it and done it well, have some version of this and have exactly the right roles plugged into these. Their sales teams and their CSR teams and all of these different teams have access to exactly what's going on with the tenants. Many of them, their customer success teams are able to go in and change tenant experiences when needed. Find like all of these different teams. And I know that kind of puts the control plane into more of a high level concept because we have all of these underlying details. But I think it's important as you're thinking as a customer, as someone trying to build SaaS or trying to deploy your applications, how are all of these different roles eventually going to interface them? So I'm not the person that they're coming to and tapping on their shoulder. Like the CFO is not coming up behind me, looking over my shoulder, like, can I see how much money we're making? I don't want that to ever be anybody's experience. So that's kind of one of the ways I think at SaaS Factor we've tried to frame up a control plane, especially when you're in a mixed room, right? With business leaders and technical leaders. This is the tool that you all use that gives you different points of view and interfaces into this operation of your product. So I'll get off my soapbox.
Well said. No, very well said.
Yeah. Really nice definition. I'm going to use it from now on, with my customers.
It's kind of fun to think of it that. I'm definitely stealing from Todd Golding, by the way. Todd, if you're out there, I'll give you attribution. And if you are listening to this and you haven't read Todd's book, Todd probably has the Bible on SaaS that he published with O'Reilly. So go look that up.
I have read it.
A lot. It's on all of our shelves, I'm sure, right? Like it's somewhere within reach right up here. So it's thinking of it that way is very important. I think there's also when we think about what you're building, I want to go back to something you said, Kamal, and Ella, both of you kind of referenced this. Tenancy isn't a native concept in very many things. This is true for AWS as well. Like Ermin, I know you and I are in the same boat on this. I built lots of tools in AWS. Some of them have tenancy as a first class concept. Many of them don't. So even if you're building with the best practices and the best tools, you still have to figure out how you manage what you're doing in those, whether it's RDS, DynamoDB, S3, all of them have ways to do multi-tenancy, but it's not necessarily a native first class concept for all of them. So you need some way to manage that. Where did what stack did I use to deploy this customer? I need to keep track of that or I'm never going to get back there again. What RDS instance are they using? Where did I put that? All of those things need to be managed. I've talked to teams that didn't really have a central control plane concept, and those things would get spread all over the place. And there would be more human in the loop conversations like, oh, we need to do this thing. How do we do it? And that's just technical debt. That's technical debt that builds up and really drags on your performance. I don't know, Ermin, like working with AWS and like thinking about like how our different tools work. Like, how do you think about like multi-tenancy when you're thinking about our services and SaaS and agentic AI, and how that ties into the control plane?
So the concept of multi-tenancy comes usually when the customer comes to you and say, we need to kind of isolate one customer from another, right? So
right.
This is actually, the typical case. And with startups, we like to start easy, and that's actually, with pool model, which means all tenants share the same database, right? And then, now coming back to your question, right? So speaking about multi-tenancy, it's usually about how to separate to make sure that data from your tenant A cannot be actually displayed in application of tenant B, right? So I'm pretty sure that I'm actually talking common principles here, but usually either you start in a pool, right? So where you have the tenant isolation comes then on the data storage level. It's either then on the relational database, which is usually the case with nowadays, or with NoSQL, or if you're building data lake, then it's on AWS terms comes in the data lake or S3. So speaking about tenant isolation, I see then customers actually going either in a pool having tenant ID per in a table, or they actually then start even then building a schema per tenant, or which is then harder to manage, or database per tenant, which then has, limitations on number of databases that you can create, right? So then cloud imposes quotas on you, and a number of clusters that you can run, a number of databases. Suddenly you start actually reaching those. Or sometimes what I usually do, right? So what I usually see is startups or customers, SaaS customers, they start with silo, but sooner or later, sorry, with pool, and then sooner or later you have a customer who says, that's all nice, but we need our isolated environment that we're sure that our database runs. So you will end up sooner or later of having mix of silo and pool models in your SaaS. So I'm not sure, Bill, if that was your question, if I answered it.
It's actually really helpful to frame it up that way, that this is a tenant isolation problem, right? And regardless, because and to make it even more complex, because we were talking about chaos today, most of the customers I work with have multiple models. Like you may have a shared solution, you may have a completely dedicated silo version, you may have a hybrid version that's kind of both at different points in the stack. And then how do you manage that? How do you keep track? Like this tenant is in the pooled version, but now I want to move them over to their own dedicated version because they got too big for that pooled solution. They're causing noisy neighbor problems. Or they had their own dedicated solution, but we've decided that that's not really worth it. They moved it to this other pricing tier. Now we're going to move them over here shared with this other customer. And different reasons that you as the SaaS provider might choose to optimize those different environments on behalf of your customer, even invisible to them. You might just be moving them around, maybe from one region to another, or one EKS cluster to another. All of those operations have to happen magically and invisibly to the customer. If they don't, you're going to hear about it pretty quick. This is probably not going to be in the best interest of your customer, which means it's not going to be in the best interest of you. Look, let me kick that back over to you. And when you think about this topic, when you think about tenants isolation, about managing all of your tenant experiences, what that means and how it impacts the ability to be agile and manage the business from a technical perspective.
Yeah, I think the key thing with how customers typically start out, as you guys mentioned, right, is it all comes down to what kind of a distribution model are you building? Are you building or who is your primary ICP, right? Is your ICP as a SaaS product, targeting developers or free users? And you typically start with something to gain product market fit, right? So you start by distributing, a quick way for you to actually stand something up. And then you actually start to look into, once, let's say, for example, your product starts to gain traction, you start to then focus on enterprises, because enterprises, obviously by word of mouth, find it to be pretty useful. So now the question comes down to, you've started by building something that was, all in the application. You built a bunch of multi-tenant interfaces, and so as you guys said, you have per tenant schema. Everything is just in a single infrastructure, right? The problem is now that your enterprise, let's say, for example, you hit your first enterprise customer, they have POC timelines. They have certain things that they actually essentially put blockers in your sales process, which comes down to primarily the isolation, which is how do you isolate me from the rest of your customers? I have my own infrastructure needs. I have my own, it could potentially be connecting to, as I said, data sources that could be in the customer's account, right? So how do you ensure that you're able to scale to such needs and, remove these blockers? And so primarily, where we see the technical challenges is, as I said, the state of the art today is to leverage something like, a bunch of these tools like Terraform, and you've built a bunch of these stacks around that. Now, the moment you need to replicate the entire thing into the customer's account, there is a whole different set of problems that you will discover for the first time, which is the customer's IT team comes back and says, look, you're not going to get access to these things, or you have completely different restrictions that you place in the customer's account. So there's a bunch of, I would say, potentially from a distribution perspective, where you start hitting a wall. And so you either now are just focusing on, as I said, the original set of customers that you've had, and all of the rest of your sales team is now stuck on this, or it could potentially be a completely, you start focusing on building the solution, and then the first set of customers start to lose traction because you're not building features for them. So there is a fine balance that you need. And so from a technical perspective, I would say the challenge tends to be that you're not building from the ground up, thinking about these different distribution channels. So which means that when the time comes, you end up hitting a wall, and then you just have to go back and hit reset on the whole thing and then start over again and build control plane V2 for you, for example.
Yeah, I think that very specific point I heard you mention along the way, that if you aren't doing this and you reach that point where a customer asks you to change your model, it's going to be very hard for you to keep that agility And it will happen. Like the startups, Armin, that you work with, when they get that big enterprise logo, they're often going to be surprised by the heavy requirements that these enterprise customers come with. Like I've worked with some large telcos. They want your architecture diagrams. They want things in their accounts. They want to know the name of your firstborn son. Like they want everything. They want to know everything about you, because their use case is continual operation, right? Zero downtime for anything across the board. And they think of the software they procure in the same way. So even if you are not doing telco, but you're selling to a telco, they look at you through a very different lens than perhaps some other enterprise customers. So you have to have that tool that allows you to be flexible and maintain different types of deployments, right? So look, I think that's a great observation. I think it's an important point that not just startups, anybody building SaaS should have in mind, that especially startups should be aware that there's a freight train somewhere on the horizon that's going to come along and knock them into left field if they're not paying attention to the way that software can be deployed and what that might mean in terms of compliance and isolation and everything else that involves these enterprise customers. Yeah.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah. Kamal, I want to kick this to you a little bit as well. Obviously, you guys took the time to create a company, build Omnistrate, to do this. And part of the reason for that is, I think, like the rest of us, you spent a lot of time building the same thing over and over with customers. Every company we went to, are creating control planes. So like there is this concept that I think you probably introduced. Like I'm not aware of anyone else really in the space of build versus buy for a control plane. I think it's important. I think it's important that people be educated that, I'm not going to say everyone should go buy off the shelf, and I don't think you would either. There's reasons to build your own control plane, I'm sure. But how would you contextualize this build versus buy decision when you're talking to a customer? Like, how do you sort of qualify? Like, oh, you seem like the right customer for us. Or like, maybe you should go do your own thing. Like when you're having that conversation on build versus buy, like where do you start that conversation and where does it sort of evolve to?
Yeah, I mean, look, there are two broader categories of customers that we see, right? One who are startups who haven't built their platform or control plane yet, and then there are bigger enterprises who have taken the journey and built some pieces of it. I'll just answer a little bit on both sides. So, from customers who haven't started, right, it makes no sense to assemble a half a dozen or dozen people to spend a couple of years building this thing and spend the time and energy on this. It just makes zero sense, right? I think customers should really focus, as Armin mentioned earlier, on finding the product market fit, make it and set up the growth channel so their thing can grow, and then look into ways how if there are optimizations that they can be done in the platform layer, how they can optimize. But I think if they can ride the ride where they don't have to, and that used to, by the way, there was and David Stock used to mention that he was from Matrix investment firm. There's something called SaaS trough, and which is like every SaaS companies have to. It was a very, very, very famous video actually. I wish I have it handy here, but he talked about the SaaS trough, basically saying that every SaaS companies, if you look at their revenue, initially they all lose money. They all lose millions of dollars,
right,
until the customer 100, where they start becoming profitable. And investors have to understand that's the nature of the SaaS. And what we are trying to do here is essentially removing that SaaS trough. And we're basically saying, no more. You need to make a choice between dealing with the complexities and scale of the needs of what you need from the distribution perspective, versus the cost that it takes to build and operate. And you can actually be profitable from customer one. And I think that is a significant advantage for the next generation startups, and that's why we are even here to do that. And part of the way we have structured our pricing and everything is also reflective of that, because we are completely outcome based from that perspective. And then there's other side of the customers who, like enterprises who have taken the journey, who have already built something. I think the question there is, what are the aspects that are working well and what are the aspects that are not working well? Let's take an example. I'm going to tie up a little bit with the previous conversation as well. Let's say for packaging, there is Helm. For deployments, there is Argo. For infrastructure, there is Terraform. For billing, there are several tools, metering and billing, and Stripe being one of them. But Stripe doesn't really help that much on the metering side, especially. Then comes the challenging around operations or things around. Uh, uh, I think I covered the billing and the integrations with the developer tooling. If you take a look at each of these solutions, right? Helm, Argo, Terraform, the metering for the billing that needs to be done, the connectivity with the developer tooling. None of these are tenant aware, and everything you have to teach each of these tools to become tenant aware. And what uh, enterprises have done is build certain aspect of it, stitch them together to build something they have. Now, what our value or our conversation to them is very simple, which is like, look, if you built something is working well, continue using that. If there are aspects of it, of the control plane which are not optimized, you can leverage us. When we anyways provide a framework which is not like use all or nothing. We have set of individual 7 modules, and you can take our module, build on top of it, or you can bring your own module, and they're all adheres to open standards. They're all open interfaces. You can bring any one of them or any set of them. You can and optimize or customize the ones that you don't have or have the optimized. So that way you have that flexibility to really come at bring your control plane and artifacts that you have done really really well and build on top of it. And most of the time, these are the things where Alok mentioned about, like, how do you deploy in customers account. Okay, they may not have that ability to be able to deploy in customers account, or they may not have ability to extend their CI/CD with different environments, or extend their control plane to different services with slightly different requirements, or extend their control plane even across different clouds, right? So how do you now unify all of these angles, right? And the each of these modules have to respect each of all of these dimensions, including tenancy, by the way, right? And so if there are certain aspects, as I said, right, certain modules which are not adhering to that, to make your platform universal, then our answer is basically just use that and continue the ones that are working well and when you have built, just continue using those ones.
Nice. Yeah, I think there's couple of important points in there. Like, this idea of decoupling the control plane is important because there are different types of organizations. One of the reasons control plane is hard to build is it tends to get kind of bespoke as you go. Like, there isn't, like, if we could have built the perfect control plane, people would have built it decades ago. The problem is different companies operate differently. And you can try plugins and say, hey, if you want to use Stripe, here's a plugin. And that goes so far. But also, some people just want to do things their own way, right? Hey, we like the way we do this. We like the way we do billing. We like the way we analyze costs. We we use these other tools for these things. I might not want that to be part of my core control plane, and that's okay. Observability is kind of one of my classic examples for this, right? It could be a control plane concept, or maybe you're already using a third party. Maybe Datadog is part of your control plane conceptually, right? Like, I just use all my dashboards out of there. All my data is there already. I don't want to build a new observability piece into my control plane. Great, do that. That's a great practice. It's a great tool. Go ahead and use that. If you don't have it already, have something that actually creates that for you, that observability. And that kind of applies to all of these different areas. Cost per tenant, how we think about cost, how we think about billing, all of these different things. Maybe you need something, maybe you don't. So I do like that. And it helps make that build versus buy decision a little bit easier, right? You don't have to say, eat the elephant. You can just take a couple spoonfuls if you want to, and we'll worry about the rest of the stuff later, right?
I mean, imagine what kind of control plane is it if it doesn't give you the flexibility to evolve, right? And that's a fundamental point, right? Like, today, maybe you're using KubeCost for doing your cost management. Maybe you're using Zabbix for operations. Maybe you are using some DevOps tool for the CI/CD. But what kind of, like, control plane? Whole advantage of the control plane is they are independent from for specific tooling, and they are able to bring, as you pointed out, from all these problem domains, or bring them tools from all these problem domains together and make them multi-tenant, make them environment agnostic. And that is the goal. And that is what the control plane, it's like. That's why I said it's an operating system with device drivers. I mean, you can bring a USB device, you can bring any. There can be many types of USB devices out there. So 100% agree.
Yeah, no, I think that's a pretty. Oh, sorry, look. Why don't you jump in on this too? Because I definitely want to hear from all of you on this topic, because I think there's slightly different perspectives we all might have on this. So go ahead.
So plus one on what Kamal said, for startups or for companies just starting, right? So it's all about providing values for their customers. So it's common sense to get something off the shelf, if it's possible, right? So usually what I see is that customers are not aware that there is something out there which is called control plane as a service, or that they are not aware that they actually can get framework like, I'm calling that framework, because you mentioned that Alok or Kamal, to kind of get bits and pieces and kind of start building it into your control plane. So they either start using third-party services, Bill, as you said, right? So observability, I'll go with third-party product to do that, and I'll still do my monitoring, and then later this will actually evolve into something bigger. But by the time that it evolves, I will suddenly start spending my most valuable resources, which is actually my engineering time. Those are most expensive things that I have. It's not the off-the-shelf product to kind of maintain internal tooling, and control plane is an internal tool, right? So instead of putting those engineers to kind of build a better product. So I think there is not a lot of products out there, and they're not actually well known, uh, that can be actually used as a control plane bits and pieces that I can actually get plugging into my kind of shell control plane. And even if I'm whatever I do, right? So the way I understand now, how Omnistrate operates, I can still kind of do my payment. I can still do my security ops, DevOps, all those things, right? By using bits and pieces of observability and building that into my shell of a control plane, right? So, and I think there is a lack of awareness of tooling like that, especially in the startup world.
Yeah.
And I would also add one more thing, which is one perspective that's helped our customers think through this build versus buy is, as a startup, right? One of the things that you have limited amount is, in addition to money, is your time, right? So which means now the question comes down to, like, is the growth, basically, is your distribution channel fundamental to the product market fit or your GTM? So if it is, then do you want to spend time building the distribution engine, or do you want to spend time building the application? Right? Then it tends to become more clear to them about, look, this is a classic buy solution versus a build. So let's just do that. Let's just go to market with this, and then we'll obviously iterate as people know that.
And startup
Right.
CEOs get that very quickly, right? Because with CEOs there, it's all about money, right? CTOs are harder to break. Alok, nothing against CTOs. I used to be startup CTO myself.
No, I think it's a fair point. Yeah, we run into a lot of these things too.
Yep. All right. 10 minutes left, or about. Let's, like all conversations, switch to agentic AI and where we're going in terms of the SaaS world, in terms of where we're going in terms of control planes. So Kamal, I mean, we've had agentic AI founders on. We've talked a lot on this show in the previous 12 episodes about what it means to do agentic AI in the world of SaaS. When you think about this topic and you think about the control plane and how it's causing everything to evolve, but specifically how the control plane is applicable to that evolution, how do you contextualize this for customers you're talking to?
I think I look at it two ways. One is I'll go back to the quote that Swami made at the keynote in New York recently, which is what are agents, right? At the end of the day, the agentic world, he defined agents as modern software, essentially. And there is traditional software, which was more imperative, and there is a modern software, which is much more dynamic, which can figure out, which can think, which can operate, execute the logic in parallel, and is much more dynamic. And the question then becomes, whether it's a traditional software or modern software, both of them needs a distribution mechanism. right? So the problem of distribution is not going away. In fact, some of the fundamental building blocks that are needed to enable the distribution is what was announced at this recent New York Summit. And he announced gateway, he announced runtime. These are application management. These are deployment management. Solving some of those like foundational building blocks of those. But still, there is a I think there's still need of control plane on top, in my personal opinion, because you still need to bring them all the tools together. You still have to make them environment agnostic. You still have to make multi-tenancy work on top. There's still challenges, quite a bit of challenges. But those, AWS has in fact given us a 300 service, more than 300 services. All of them are building blocks for building these, amazing control planes. So, anyways, coming back to the main question, I think one point is that, which is agents themselves are modern software. They themselves needs a distribution mechanism or distribution channel. And I think there's a need now the control planes to further evolve and represent agents as a first-class citizen, and represent where some of the responsibilities of guardrails, being able to present what what answers are going to the customers, and being able to get the telemetry so it can learn by itself and get better over time. The things about the accuracy of the results, the things about how do you do metering, because GPUs are not at the same cost as CPU. And so how do you
Right.
deal, you're not talking about, you're dealing with maybe per second calculation on the cost and figuring it out how much GPU was used for a tenant. And so you need to have that level of accuracy. So the requirements have evolved to deal and really represent agent as a first-class citizen. That is one aspect. The second aspect I will say is, the SaaS itself is just being uplifted because we are in the AI. The SaaS itself has to be agentic as well, which means it has to be also dynamic. And you cannot just expect the control planes, everything becomes dynamic, but the control planes remain static. No, control planes also themselves have to become dynamic. And what does that mean, right? And how can they become smarter, rather than being those static workflows of the past? Okay, I did provisioning, I did update, I did upgrade. How can they be smarter about it? How can they do predictive scaling? How can they figure out the failures in advance? How can they do auto-tune the workloads from the cost perspective? And so there are a lot of things that put, like, enabling dynamism or of what agentic world is bringing in, and that notion of has to be applied to the control plane as well. So those are two broader areas where I think that AI is influencing control planes and SaaS in general.
Yeah.
Can I just add on this, right? So if you look at the definition of SaaS that I'm at least using, right, there is no maybe there is one written by Todd, right? But SaaS is basically piece of business functionality running as a software at your provider, right? That you can use as a service, right? And now if you look at AI agents, right? Agent, and I'm throwing that just in this round. An agent is basically just a piece of software, right? So a bit smarter piece of software running somewhere that you can actually use to support your business functionality. So it's basically SaaS. Now, those agent providers, they suddenly deal with exactly same challenges as traditional software SaaS developers, right? So they still have tenant isolation. They still need to do metrics. Kamal, you mentioned that a couple of seconds. They still need to know who was actually, querying those agents, how to build them, and all those things, right? And all those things that I mentioned, this is actually, again, function of a control plane. So I think we need to go in a direction of control plane for agents. It's, I'm not sure what you think, right? But this is actually what was keeping me busy, lately.
Exactly, 100%. And I would argue that the onus has increased further on control plane. They have to do more now. All the routing problems, the billing requirements, the guardrails, so many more problems have emerged with the smarter application. You need to smarter control plane to manage.
Yeah.
There's actually an interesting stat I heard the other day, and I wish I could attribute it, but I don't remember off the top of my head where I saw it. But over 95% of the agentic experiments that are started fail. Now, we're kind of familiar, like startup SaaS probably wasn't that different. Probably 95% of startup SaaS failed as well. But I think really what we're starting to see, and like what you've both talked about here, is there's even more complicated aspects of managing agents. This it made developing them simpler, manage them actually could be harder. The different pricing models, like outcome-based pricing, involves more telemetry and more calculations and more business visibility into these problems, not less. It's not like you can just throw agents over the wall and hope they work and be like, good luck, everybody. hope your software works for it. It's gotten even more important to do these control planes now and to have some visibility. And I don't know, maybe we don't call it a control plane anymore. Maybe there's a new agentic version of this in the world, but the concepts remain almost identical as far as I can tell. I don't think there's any control plane concept we were talking about: deploying, managing, billing, cost, observability, all of those topics. Governance, especially governance, because we're talking about people's personal data, and a lot of these, agentic models, all still on the table and all still very important. So I think that's pretty critical. We haven't heard from you on this subject.
Yeah.
Where are you in the agentic world right now?
Yeah, I think I was going to say one thing that's actually been constant is that agentic AI is constantly evolving, right?
Yeah.
Which means one of the things that we've seen is, RAG came and went almost, right, at this point. But RAG has also become a very loose definition now. So things are evolving. The industry is trying to figure out best ways to obviously build these applications. Now the question comes down to, are you ready to adopt the new
place? We're right around 11 o'clock right now. We did start a couple minutes late, but I'd like to wrap it up maybe with just one more quick round. Where is this going in the future? If you just put on your crystal ball or your magic hat for a minute and think about, where is this control plane concept going to be if we got together a year from now or 5 years from now and talked about it? What are we going to see that's different about this? Kamal, go ahead.
I see it as a co-pilot.
Can't hear.
Can you hear me now? Yeah, I was just saying, I see it as a co-pilot for the business. I see it as a co-pilot for business operations, managing personas and enabling personas from FinOps, SecOps, DevOps, SREs, and being the central point for the customers to be able to consume the software. And how in the evolving world of more regulatory requirements, more agentic world, more smarter applications, how it comes together, I think there will be more and more responsibilities on this co-pilot for the entire platform, or I will still call Copilot for the cloud operating system. How about that?
Nice. I'll look.
Yeah, I would actually say that with agents and AI, Gen AI in general, right, it's actually unlocked a completely new set of use cases and also a new set of users and builders, right? So we have non-technical users and builders who can actually start now, they can go to market almost faster than any time before. And so for that, the better abstractions and building those things that make it simpler to distribute is going to be even more important. And so that's where a control plane obviously can come in and then essentially do a lot of the automation that they had to build previously themselves.
Nice. Herman, what do you think?
I think we will see more and more agentic startups that will actually build agents as a service, right? Which is actually SaaS, and they will still fight exactly the same problem as the traditional SaaS, as I said before, right? So I think the problems will stay the same. They will get more granular, as Kamal said, right? But I think all those solutions that we have for SaaS can be also applied on the agent, because it's a piece of software running, right, that you're offering to your customers, right? So for me, control plane will still stay. It will become probably a little bit smarter and a little bit more detailed, but it's the old problems that we know from 20 years ago.
Yeah, I think I'll throw in my final thoughts. I think we haven't seen all of these models yet. One of the things we're suffering through with the agentic world is we haven't seen the Salesforce model or the Databricks model or these large SaaS providers be really successful and other companies trying to model themselves out of it. We're still looking for those early cases where it's like, I want to be like them. That's how I'm going to do it. They were successful. And so even the tools that we use to operate agents are still lagging behind until we get some of those examples of what good looks like. But they're coming. We've seen lots of good experiments work. Those 5% can be pretty outstanding. Some of the small companies that are doing this are great. Some of the experiments that larger companies have done are great. It's just codifying some of these things. And in my opinion, when I think about the control plane, we're going to see the control plane evolve to map to those models. And you'll need to, if you built SaaS already and you're thinking about deploying agents with it, you're going to need to evolve with it. So if you've got your own control plane, you've got to think about what it means, not just to throw things on the wall, but throw things like agents over the wall now. And what does it mean for them to be independent, but still manage to somehow be updated and phone home and all those other concepts we had to worry about in SaaS already. All right. With that, I think we're about at an hour. We've already gone over a little bit of an hour. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I think fun episode. Really enjoyed this topic about control planes, and really enjoyed having Omnistrate on. And for joining.
Yeah, that was great.
Awesome.
Great conversation.
Yeah. Thank you, folks.
Thanks, everybody.